Guests, participants, and valuable presenters. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to the fifth lecture series that is conducted by Nepal Geotechnical Society. Today, we are going to have a very important lecture. The title of the lecture is Application of Remote Sensing and Numerical Modeling in the Investigation of Landslide. As earlier presentation, it seems to be very important in our Nepalese context, as Nepalese, we are having a very prone areas of landslides in our Himalayan region and all other regions. So I think all of the participants will be benefited from this lecture series. Nepal Geotechnical Society is a non-profitable organization which has been serving as a platform for sharing research, knowledge, and skills in the field of geotechnical engineering. Executives of Nepal Geotechnical Society, very important paper presenters of today, and all participants of the lecture series. Nepal Geotechnical Society is hosting this type of lecture series from time to time on a monthly basis for the benefit of members of the society. So this is the fifth such lectures during the period of this executive committee. And this executive committee has planned to happen this type of event on a monthly basis. So hopefully there will be, it will be continued that way. This is our topography. It's very, very steep. It's within a stretch of 120 kilometers. The altitude ranges from 70 meters to 8,848. So this is unique in the world. So because of this combination of topography and geology, and also the soil types and the formation of soil types and degree of weathering, those things contribute to very badly to the slope stability. That is the reason in Nepal we have many areas, and we need on the one hand, and on the another hand, what we need is we need facilities in the, to connect communities, to provide facilities to the communities. So we need road, we need transmission line, we need irrigation, water supply, and many things. So we have, on the one hand, we have very bad geology and it's landslide prone area. On the other hand, we need to connect all these settlements and provide service to them. So this gives us very big challenge. And I hope in today's lecture from our eminent professors and presenters, we will get some insight into how we can identify or characterize some of the unstable areas, so mega landslides or other instabilities through modeling as well as some GIS-based applications. And I hope this methodology will give us a good idea on where to anticipate what, and where landslide prone area is located, and where we can be a little bit safer or there is a lower hazard. So I think I will not take much time. We wish to hear from the presenters, and we will have a very good opportunity to interact with the professors, and I think we will be benefited, all of us. So with this, I think and FRBC chair in Resource Geotechnics in Department of Earth Sciences at Simon Fraser University of Canada. He is also the Vice President of International Society of Rock Mechanics for North America. Similarly, another presenter of today is Dr.
Professor Dr. Nick Roser. He has been the professor in Department of Geology at Durham's University, UK. Similarly, third presenter of today is Jesse Misiorek. He has been doing MSc. He has been working as MSc researcher in geotechnical characteristics of landslide in Nepal.
I'm going to start with a general presentation on the landslides that we've been working on at Simon Fraser and over the last 20 years or so. And these are all fairly big landslides ranging from about 20 million cubic meters up to 1.4 billion cubic meters. I'll show you some of the ways that we've investigated these landslides and our approach. And then our master student, Jesse Misiorek, who's co-supervised between myself and Nick Rosser from Durham, is going to talk about the work we've been doing over the last year at the Jura landslide, applying some of these techniques. And then Nick, I think, is going to talk more about, say, the work he's been doing, I think, for the last 15 or so years, maybe more, in Nepal, and to try and, so the last two talks will be specifically Nepal related. So, just as an outline of what I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to look at, say, state-of-the-art, say, multi-sensor, so photogrammetry, LiDAR, thermal imaging, and hyperspectral, where we can actually now look at the mineralogy and the changes in mineralogy of the rock that we're imaging. And we're going to look at how we can apply these to major landslides and major rock slopes. One of the things I'm going to emphasize as I go through is the influence of kinematics, is what controls how these slopes fail in terms of the three-dimensional geometry, and also damage or brittle fracture that occurs in these landslides. They don't usually fail as one big block, they usually break up, and there's tension cracks and lots of evidence. So we'll look at some of that. I'll look at examples of the application of geomechanical models. At Simon Fraser, we run everything from limit equilibrium to three-dimensional brittle fracture codes. And we need to use that whole toolbox to be able to look at different types of failure. And then finally, something that I'll talk about, and then Jesse will show you related to the Jura landslide, and we've also got the equipment here we can show you at the front there. We're doing a lot of work in trying to show these landslides and in, say, mixed and virtual reality. How can we bring the landslide into the room so we can walk around the landslide and look at it in our office? And so we'll look at that as we go through. Our research approach is shown here, and I'm just quickly going to go through these slides. We think that there's three operations: characterization of the rock slope, monitoring of the rock slope, and modeling of the rock slope. Each one of those has to be done linked together. You can't model a rock slope without good characterization. You're going to get meaningless results. If you're monitoring a rock slope, that's telling you, is your modeling correct? So all of these we see as a feedback loop. And so in terms of characterization, we're looking at, say, field mapping, all these virtual reality techniques, we're still never going to get away from field mapping. And looking at laser scanning or LiDAR, photogrammetry, thermal, hyperspectral, and applications of geophysics to actually give us the geometry, the structure, geological structure, the water conditions, the mechanisms of the failure, and how things change with scale. Whether we're looking at a 20-meter high rock slope or whether we're looking at a 1,000-meter high landslide. And monitoring, again, the monitoring through from conventional GPS to INSTAR, satellite and ground-based radar techniques, LiDAR, photogrammetry, obviously borehole inclinometers, and change detection. So looking at multiple images of these techniques and comparing how the displacements change with time. And that has to be linked to the characterization, because faults may be causing our monitoring results. We can't ignore the geology when we interpret the results of our monitoring. Similarly, if we don't monitor and characterize correctly, we can't do the modeling. So these are all linked together. And our modeling techniques range from simple limit equilibrium, and I would always try and get the students to start with the simplest technique first. So we still look at limit equilibrium, and we still look at wedge failures, and we'll look at, say, basically Morgan-Stewart price and block. Just an example of the structure. This is a coal mine in BC. there's no way that you can deny that that's structurally controlled, what's happening in that pit. We've just got this beautiful kind of fold. We can see water coming down the hinge of the fold. We can see that this footwall is just formed by the limb of the fold. But when we start to zoom in with high-resolution photography, we can see that that's folded there, and that fold is starting to cause a failure. If we zoom in again, we can see that it's fracturing through that fold. We have to consider brittle fracture. And we can zoom in again, and this is how that failure is occurring, breaking through the hinge of the fold. So this is in an open pit, but I put it up because inside landslides, these processes are occurring. And unfortunately, we can't see them. From a mathematics point of view, we don't just consider the sliding surface, which we may have done in a limit equilibrium analysis. We have to consider how is this landslide released at the back. You can see it's fracturing at the back. How is it released on the sides along the joints? And look at the toe here, it's all brittle fracture trying to heave through that fold. So these are complex things we're dealing with, and we have to take that complexity into account. And to give you an example, and this is UK, and here you can see soil coming out of in here, and they just happen to be videoing this as this occurred. But what we can see is that this more and more soil, and this whole thing just fails in one go. There are a lot with the kind of, everybody now has a cell phone, so if you go to Dave Petley's landslide blog, there are more and more videos of landslides. And we can't now model landslides without ignoring these videos. Landslides, quite often, we look at the frame by frame through the landslide. So we take this video and we'll go frame by frame through it and then see how does it fail. And so if we take these as frames of the landslide going from this direction, we can see in here initially we get this wedge with soil coming out from the apex of the wedge. Then the slope is split up into an area where we have a passive toe with a buttress. We have an area in the middle where there's buckling of the rock going on in an active zone. And we've got all of these occurring if we follow that landslide frame by frame. So these are not simple things we're dealing with. So our research approach at SFU is field mapping first, which is we're here in Nepal for Jesse, we're doing field mapping. And so all of this kind of fancy modeling and fancy remote sensing has to be backed up with field mapping. Remote sensor. And why remote sensing is good is we can't field map 50 meters up or 100 meters up on a rock slope. You know, unless we want to climb down it, and but basically the remote sensing lets us get to places where you can't get to for safety reasons. And then from the remote sensing we'll go to the modeling, and then this whole thing we're linking with geovisualization. These are our remote sensing methods. So we have a robotic camera, so we put this on a tripod and we program it, and it just takes overlapping photographs, allows us to build three-dimensional images of our slope. So we're doing these with 50 megapixel resolution, so we can get very good definition from long ranges. We use high-resolution photography, and we use UAVs. So the UAVs allow us that when we're looking at something from a photograph or we're looking from a LiDAR, we can there's things we can't see. UAVs can get in much closer and they can get over the things that you couldn't see before. So UAVs have transformed the way we're actually doing our work now. And we've got our laser scanner, which Nick from Durham has got the same laser scanner. This has a 4-kilometer range, so these laser scanners have revolutionized the way that we can actually image slopes now. Airborne LiDAR we will use routinely. We'll also do handheld LiDAR scanning to measure roughness and things of joints. We use long-range thermal and hyperspectral, so thermal imaging, what's the temperature, we measure the temperature of the rock, and what we want to do is really look for changes. If we've got water coming out of our rock, we'll see those in the thermal changes. And similarly with the hyperspectral, we can look for clay alteration, and I'll show you examples. Satellite and ground-based INSAR for looking at deformation and movement. So this remote sensing is applied to both characterizing our rock slopes or landslides, and also for monitoring landslides. Very nice kind of fold that is plunging towards us down here. We can see seepage coming out of that fold. It's come down the hinge of the fold, and this is about probably about 900 meters high. So what we've actually done in this case is we've gone along and from a distance of about 2.5 kilometers, we've imaged this with a laser scanner. We mesh that laser scanning image, and then what we'll do is we'll drape on the high resolution photography. So if we look at this area in here, this is what we do. We're draping on 50 megapixel resolution photographs. It's all georeferenced, so now we can actually go in. It's quite difficult to map from a laser scanner sometimes, but when we put this high resolution photography on it, we can go in there and really map in detail. And what we're interested in this case, structure affect the damage within the rock. And if we carry on in here, this is the photography and the photogrammetry. What we can actually do, every time I touch this thing, it's stopping it, so I won't touch it anymore. So what we will drape onto this image now is the hyperspectral scanning. So what this hyperspectral scanning, this is a limestone outcrop with shales in it, and you can see the water. This is telling us the changes in the mineralogy. This is our thermal image, where we can actually see again the seepage, and therefore where the water is coming out of the slope. So if we're actually wanting to map water on a very distant rock slope, we can use this to measure where the seepage is coming out. And is that we have something like 285 bands that we can look at. So if we just cycle through those different bands, we can actually pick out different mineralogies, and actually it can help us sometimes to see whether changes in erosion will come out, for instance, of it, and changes in alteration. So this is an example where we've taken a rockfall case. So we have this, again, this is about 600 meters high. We're looking at a window in here, and in the different imagery. So here we've got the photogrammetry, here's the thermal, here's the hyperspectral, picking out the seepage in the sea with those different bands, different ages of rockfall. So this is the thermal image showing the groundwater seepage. And this is the same thing with the hyperspectral image. And so what we're attempting to do with this is to be able to kind of map different ages of rockfall events, being able to look at, say, the roughness of the planes that the joints are being released and how much brittle fracture is occurring. Again, cycling through this just shows how we can, with the hyperspectral image, how we just cycle through the bands at the bottom there. We're just showing a few of them, but there's, as I said, about 280 or so. These are all showing different images related to the minerals that are present in the rock slope. From the modeling, this is the range of modeling codes that we use at SFU. So if we're doing continuum, so we ignore our joints, and if we're looking at soil slopes, or if we try and say our rock is sufficiently jointed or fractured that we can do as a continuum, then we'd use these different FLAC and RS2 and the three-dimensional versions of those. If it's jointed, then we go to UDEC and 3DEC to actually be able to kind of model the blocks that are inside the slope. If it's fractured, then we'll run a model which will actually start from a continuum and basically will continuously remesh as we fracture it. So we can actually, I'll show examples of that and in a moment. So we're looking at, say, brittle fracture and kinematics as some of our most important things. And this is an example, say for instance, of a slope where in France, where clearly brittle fracture is important. And this is what we've used that video fractography for. So what we've actually done is we did the same thing. We went in there frame by frame, and then we actually said, well, can we reproduce the cracking that we see in that block in the model? And this is using UDEC Voronoi and a technique which we can, here is 3DEC with brittle fracture. In here, this is these brittle fracture codes which start off as a continuum and basically fracture right through to this debris. So we can actually now kind of cover all of these different types of fracture mechanism. I'll just go through some of the techniques. This is a couple of years ago where Nick visited Canada, where we can see this is the Frank slide. It occurred in 1903. About 90 people were killed when this failed. It was a 30 million cubic meter volume. And basically, it was the limbs of an anticline dipping out of the slope in limestone beds. Here we've got the different imaging. So with the students doing photographs, Jesse's there doing photogrammetry, a PhD doing LiDAR, and there's Nick who's on the thermal and hyperspectral. So imaging all of the slopes from the same place at the same time. And this is the type of data that we can get. So this is up to with this 400 meter lens. When we did that, we had an old scanner which would only do a kilometer. When we went back a couple of years ago, this is the image we get with the new laser scanner from, say, a distance of about 3 kilometers. So we're actually basically being able to zoom in. This is our hyperspectral image of that landslide. And just to give you an example of these different images, this is the 400 millimeter. On the top, it's a 400 millimeter photogrammetry of the small area at the top of South Peak, which is still moving a bit. And this is the laser scanner taken 80 million points in that laser scan from a distance of 3 kilometers. So this, I think, technique for Nepal is the kind of technique which we think would be very useful, where you can image these large mountain ranges from distance. We took that, and we've done several stages of numerical modeling. So this is the Continuum approach where we can model the landslide. This is where we put in the fractures. So we put the hinge of the fold and the bedding on the fold, and we'll then look at the modeling it in UDEC. And then this is of the South Peak, a three-dimensional fracture model. So, and we're going back, eventually we're going to do another model based on the more recent remote sensing. The Hope slide is another example, and so this is just outside of Vancouver. This is our image here. We can, on the bottom there, we can see thermal images with seepage from the dark blue at the base. This is our landslide. It occurred in 2 discrete events, one at 4 o'clock in the morning, one at 7 o'clock in the morning. The first one blocked a road with the people all pulled up at that road and were stopped. There were about 4 people killed when the second landslide came down 3 hours later. And so what we've done is taken all this remote sensing data that we've collected, and we run a 3-dimensional brittle fracture model where we simulate first a prehistoric landslide, then a stage 1, and then a stage 2 of the failure. So we were able to reproduce that, but clearly we can't do that with a 2-dimensional limit equilibrium analysis. It has to be 3-dimensional analysis because of the effect of the structures that are causing this landslide. This is the Randa rock slide. So here, brittle fracture. And this landslide again occurred in 2 different episodes, one in April 1991, one in May. And so what we were able to do is to use these brittle fracture codes to fracture the rock and to simulate these 2 stages of failure. And also in the third one there was simulating this gradual retrogressing as these blocks are toppling out of this landslide. That landslide at the top there occurred over a period of 7 hours of continuous rockfall. So it's a very, rather kind of not unusual rock slide in that, from that point of view. We worked on the Vajont slide in Italy. This is the day before the landslide. This was basically in 1963. So this is the reservoir behind the dam. This is the town just downstream of the dam. Almost 2,000 people lost their life when this dam was perfectly designed by the structural engineers, but the block came down and basically displaced the water out of the reservoir, and this is the dam, this is the town the day after. I mean, there was about 2 or 3 years of measurement of these movements and lowering the reservoir, filling the reservoir before this failure occurred. So there were people put in jail over this landslide. And we've been back and we've done, say, the same kind of thing from a couple of kilometers. We do the photogrammetry, and essentially we can go in there and we can map the failure surface, which nobody could ever get to before, and we can actually, based on that data, we are able to do models, so there's a brittle fracture model here, and then a three-dimensional brittle fracture here. So all based with the characterization data. And we see this like a chair of the landslide with brittle fracture going on in the change of the chair from steep to shallow. So the kinematics again is controlling where this fracturing occurs. I think we'll skip this one in the interest of time. Jesse's looking there thinking, we ran this video here. This is a 1.4 billion cubic meter landslide, which is just upstream from a reservoir. They were building this when the violent failure, it was just about to occur. So they actually visited Italy and did a lot of work in Italy, because if this had been mobilized, they were quite worried. And so they've got all sorts of boreholes and lots of monitoring this, and so they've really characterized this landslide very, very well. Jesse's kind of wondering, well, this blew up his computer today, and he had to redo the hard drive and everything. But this is the airborne LiDAR. So if we look on the left there, a completely forested landslide. You can see very little. Once you do airborne LiDAR, you basically can see all the damage, the fracturing, the lineations. It removes the trees so you can see what is going on. A very powerful technique to be able to kind of go in there and map the rock mass. They've also got drainage adits in here, so we don't need to just do remote sensing at the surface. We can also do them underground. So we did underground photogrammetry in the laser, in the drainage adits, and we also did underground LiDAR in the drainage adits. We did UAV on the backscar. So this is the UAV, the backscar there. Nobody had ever mapped that before because you just couldn't get to it. It's inaccessible. It's about 100 meters high. So we did that. We were able to map all the joints and the structures in there to give them a better database. I'll skip the next stage and move on to the geovisualization. And so this is going to lead to what Jesse will demonstrate a bit later on. So we've got, in terms of, we've got lots of data coming from this, like we said, 80 million points or what. We've got our field mapping data, so lots and lots of data we're collecting. We have to analyze that data. And now we're in this very trendy word that's all out there called big data. We've got so much data now, it's getting difficult to deal with it. All of these different, so we're actually having to move to ways of automatically interpreting data and machine learning and things like that. There are also, we need better ways to communicate our data. Based on that, we've moved to this type of way of say, the type of game that you'll all see with these goggles in the virtual reality. So in the virtual reality environment, we can actually say, well, this is with your smartphone. So you're going to download these apps where you can do fancy little augmented reality things. We're not really interested in that. This is like being in an environment. What we're using is the mixed reality. And so here we see that the students here have got an open pit with all the underground workings underneath the open pit. And they're able to, both looking at that, and they're able both to walk around it and be able to examine everything that's going on. And we're doing that with landslides. And this is what we would refer to as mixed reality. A couple of examples. This is, we're doing, say, virtual core. So with a cell phone, we take a picture of the core, and we build three-dimensional models of the core. And now I've got a master student who's working on being able to have a virtual core show, so you can log up, I want to see core box number 56, bring it out, and you can actually check whether it's been logged properly. Or you can re-log it as well. So in terms of, if we move forward a little bit on this, so here's the different sticks of core that we've got there. You can actually measure the roughness. We can do this on split core as well, and as an example here, this is, say, in the mining industry, they'll cut the core, and then what they'll do with that core is they'll put it through some kind of hyperspectral type of imaging where they can actually work out where the clay alteration is. So if we look in here, we'll start, when he presses this button here, you'll start to see that it will delineate the clay alteration in this core. So that, you see the image there now, which is bringing out the clay. So this is quite powerful if we're trying to characterize our core and the strength of our core, if we can actually measure the clay content on it. We can't do a lot of logging on split core, but we can go in there on these cores and we can actually measure the orientation of fractures and things like that. What we've also done for the geologists in the audience in here is that, you look at a thin section, and what we can actually do is put that thin section as though it's in the optical microscope. We could just rotate the thin section and look at, say, the polarization of it. So we can actually do all that stuff that people really hated doing sometimes in geology classes, looking down the microscope. You can teach it now much better. And so from a communicate, here we've got a virtual joint profiler. So we're placing this, measuring roughness. We've got a laser scan with a handheld scanner. We place this on there, we push a button, and we calculate the roughness parameters. We can put that anywhere we want, so we can look at the directional roughness on that hologram. So it's not just communication. We can do measurements with this now, which were pretty difficult to do. So if we had that joint there, you can bring it back to the office, and the engineer can say, what is the direction of sliding? What's the roughness in that direction? So it's we can compare it with our JRC charts. And we can then stand around it. We can do the GIS. So we've taken that LiDAR that we looked at, we put it in the GIS, and we're now able to see the variation in slope angle on the LiDAR. And we can actually look at GIS aspect or GIS, so we can change it either to slope or aspect. But what we want to do if we're going to do a geotechnical slope stability analysis of this is we want to look at the shear surfaces. So what the PhD student who's just done that is he took all the borehole data, there was a lot of boreholes because of the big dam there, he created that data to form surfaces of the shear surfaces. And there are 8 kilometers there, so it's pretty accurate. And so what we actually do then is we put those shear surfaces through the GIS, we compare the slope in the shear surfaces with what's happening on the ground surface. And we could see that the changes in dip and dip direction of the shear surface were being mirrored in the LiDAR. Where there was lots of fracturing, it was where the surface of the shear surface was changing. In another landslide here, one of the things that we obviously like to be able to do is to take sections through our landslide. This is a landslide we're working on next to a field. So you can see there's the LiDAR, which we built a model. There's a big lineation running up and along the right there. And that is a big fault. And they were worried about the failure of that fault. They were particularly worried when they did bathymetry. So when they did the bathymetry, and we'll switch the bathymetry on now, we can see. So what they can do then is to actually basically take those sections and we can just pull them out of the slope. And so whatever orientation of section you want there, you can just pull those orientations out, and you can have these be in your meeting looking at them with the client to be able to to interrogate the data as much as possible. Taking this HoloLens out and replacing a compass. So what the HoloLens does is if you're in this room, the HoloLens scans this whole room. So it basically does a scan of the whole ceiling and all the floors, so it gives you a reference. So we actually thought, well, let's go to a rock slope, and when we can go and see if it works on a rock slope. And so this is the consultant from SRK wearing one of these HoloLenses, and this is the sequence of operations which we're now doing in underground mines as well as in slopes. So we stand at the outcrop, and you can see what he's doing there is meshing the outcrop. And he's doing that by just looking at it. So as he looks at the outcrop, it meshes all those joints. And then he'll color code that according to distance, because you've georeferenced it, so you know how far you are away from it. So basically this is the mesh. So we've got this menu there which we could basically interrogate, do a lot of different options. So this is color coded at different distances away from where he is standing. Now he's actually color coded like a GIS aspect map. So he's trying to look at, these are the joint sets that we're dealing with. So different colors mean different joints. And now he's got his 3D, so he's done this, and now he's standing at the outcrop with a three-dimensional photograph of the rock slope. And there it is, there's the three-dimensional image that he just got from actually just looking at the outcrop. So we can now blow that up, and we can actually, and this is the first generation. The second generation's got better resolution of the HoloLens, but you can see quite clearly the joints and the structures just coming out. So we've got those joints and structures coming out, so obviously what we want to do is measure them. So what we can actually do is we can look at them, because it's a georeference mesh, so if you look at those triangles, it gives us our dip and dip direction. So what he'll do is he'll look at that and he'll click it and he'll plot up on the stereo net. And then he'll look at another fracture. So now we can actually plot on the stereo net and define our joint sets just by looking at it. And we've compared that with a hand compass, and we've compared it, and we get very good agreement of the technique. And so I'll just, we draw on there, if it's a fault or it's a structure, we can have a table which comes up like a joint survey chart. And we can have a virtual keyboard. So if we basically go a little bit forward. So this is the different attributes we might want to input. So these will go straight into a package which is then stored so we can take it back to the office. And there we are, we can type on a virtual keyboard at the outcrop any of the data that we want to. And then the last thing that we're doing is that when you're out on these outcrops, you're continuously looking through papers if you're doing joint surveys and things. So we've actually all said, let's take out the JRC chart with us so we can be looking at our outcrop. We can have these different charts that are there that we can actually see in front of the outcrop as we do the mapping. So I think in terms of research, I'll stop now so I can hand over. I mean, these are just quite long, but really I've just said we're measuring a lot of data on the top here. What actually matters? We can measure now thousands and thousands of joints. We still need to be measuring the ones that really control the failure. So that's what we kind of think. We now look into what we call first order, second order, third order, and fourth order structures. And the ones we really want to get are these major ones that are faults and structures which control the failure. We're looking at, say, structural and remote sensing domains. So how does the remote sensing change? How does it relate to the structure? We look at the slope damage and damage domains. So we measure the intensity of fracturing on these. We look at, say, how does the block shape affect the kinematics is something that we're working on. Improving the linkages between these characterization, monitoring, and modeling. Looking at evolution of the landslide in terms of the tectonics, how does that affect the landslide? How does the changing geomorphology affect it? And engineering, how does engineering operations change it? We don't just simply do a rock mass model, nice GSI model, we have to consider damage and time. And the whole thing where these are the final things in terms of this is relating to modeling, this is relating to both modeling and characterization, is we're moving into this machine learning area of trying to recognize different patterns in our data, and we're moving into this enhanced 3D geovisualization.
Right now, I'm really excited to show you some preliminary results I have on my topic, which is engineering geological characterization of the 2014 Nepal landslide. It's also called the Santosi landslide. I'll talk about how I integrated field remote sensing, numerical modeling, and I'll finish off with a how I brought all of my data into a virtual and mixed reality environment. And at the end, I'll try to show a kind of live preview and demonstration after everyone's done. So here's just an example of the entire 1.5 kilometer landslide as a virtual model. So before I start, I'd just like to introduce myself. As I said, I graduated with an earth science degree at Simon Fraser University. You can see on the right here, I played ice hockey since I was 2 years old. And I still ended up getting a hockey scholarship to play at Simon Fraser, which got me my degree. And also when I was frustrated studying, you're able to go out there and kind of have a little bit of fun. So As I mentioned, I'm in my master's in engineering geology, focusing on the Jerry landslide using different remote sensing techniques. Some work experience that I have, I worked with the federal and provincial government of Canada. This is oil and gas in Fort McMurray, Alberta, Saskatchewan. I also worked exploration geology in hard rock and soft rock gold mining. A lot of helicopter assisted mapping, hard rock, and yeah, it was super fun. The last 2 years I've really focused on slope stability, a lot of geotechnical engineering. This ranges from Yukon, Alaska, and a lot in the Canadian Rockies. This works. So the outline for my 30 minutes here, I'll briefly go over my research, and then I'll go over my methods. So you can see here a lot of remote sensing with the laser scanner, photogrammetry, UAV assisted, a lot of help with NSET, RAM and DMAR helped a lot last year. You can see the hazard mapping and how I brought this all into numerical modeling. So as I mentioned, last year I did field work for about 3 weeks, and I'll show really preliminary results I have. As I mentioned, it's halfway through my master's. And I'll finish off with how I brought all this into interactive mixed reality landslide geodatabase. So doing, as Doug mentioned, the mapping on outcrops to have your results in numerical modeling. So instead of having it just your computer with all your information, you can have it all within that and communicate results. So again, I apologize to everyone who knows this location. The Juri landslide, my sunny site, is situated in South Asia. This is within the Himalayan mountain range. As mentioned, it's characterized by steep, rugged topography. It's extremely susceptible to slope failure due to monsoonal precipitation, active tectonics. On August 2nd in the early morning 2014, a large destructive landslide, so it was about 5 million cubic meters, occurred along the Sunkosi River. This is about 70 kilometers northeast of Kathmandu in the Sinapalchuk region, really close to Barabisa. I apologize if I'm pronouncing anything wrong, and some spelling might be off too, so and if anyone knows that and would like to tell me about it, I'd really appreciate it. It caused 150 fatalities, destroyed 24 houses, and it displaced over 400 families. It also destroyed the Arnaco Highway, a major trade and strategic route. Damaged the Sunkosi and Sunama hydropower plants, and also created a large landslide dam lake. That next slide here. This is footage of the day of the landslide. Hopefully this video works. The 1.5 kilometer landslide came down, destroyed the Arnaco Highway here, was able to go through the Sunkosi River and about 50 meters up on the other side of the bank. The hydropower plant downstream, a lot of work was done on the lake, measuring it, because a lot of concern was outburst flooding and what it would cause. And this is 3 days, next slide here. 3 days after, you can see the water slowly starting to drain through, combination of blasting with the army and the precipitation. I think, as I was reading through some articles, it was about 37 days later it was actually able to breach without causing major flooding downstream. So my objectives I plan on completing for my master's. So what were the potential failure mechanisms that caused the landslide? I want to know what caused it, but I also want to see over many years how the resisting forces reduced due to different driving forces, such as multiple earthquakes over the last 100 years, heavy monsoonal precipitation that reduced the rock mass to have this one triggering event that caused this entire landslide. Are there potential hazards currently present at the Juri landslide site? And if there are, what can I do to contribute into Nepal as an international student? What is the relationship between landscape evolution and slope instability? So I want to see if there are any active slope processes. So I'll go over change detection. I'll have 4 years of remote sensing data. I'll show you what I use. And how I'm going to integrate everything into integrated, interactive, virtual and mixed reality Juri landslide geodatabase. This enables an immersive and enhanced engineering geological 3D geophys experience. You're able to see GPS locations, and at the end I'll go through everything in more detail. As I mentioned, it's a first investigative analysis. There's numerous assumptions as it's halfway through my master's, and there's a lot more work I need to, that's why I'm here, to put into it. Before I get started, I was just like, in spite of the size, damage, and loss of life, the Jerry landslide, there's not too many, as an international student, you want to find papers that were done in the location. There's not many done on the geotechnical aspect. A lot of papers I would like to acknowledge that were extremely helpful for me for preliminary modeling before I was coming out, was a lot focused on the kind of the water, the outburst flooding, but it also was super helpful for me for my numerical modeling. And a lot of all the papers I read, always kind of the future recommendations were to have more engineering, geological characterization, and geotechnicals, geotechnics to come here and provide. That's what I'm trying to do, is trying to provide some kind of, hopefully, information on that. So again, I'll briefly go over my area. The Suncoast River Basin ranges from tropical in the south and subtropical climate to the north. The Suncoast is comprised of several smaller river systems mixed with the Boti, Kosing, and Berbice. Yearly rainfall data illustrates that this catchment receives around 3,000 millimeters of rain annually, with 80% during monsoon. I'll show some photographs here. Last year I came during March, and I was just trying to see how much water was in the location here. This is above the headscarp. I was doing a lot of hazard engineering geomorphological mapping to see the amount of water, creeks that are going. You can see another creek kind of incising the landslide here. The landslide is on this location. Again, with active water coming down the landslide. You can see the depositional zone here. I won't go into the complex regional and tectonics of the Himalayan region. That's beyond the scope of my work. What I'm just going to focus on is my location here in the A. So as I mentioned, the Kosi River Basin lies in a complex regional setting with major east-west trending geological structures. My location here, if you guys can just see it right here, to the south, the main frontal thrust system. Again, to the south in the location, very close, is the main boundary thrust, and to the north is the main central thrust. So these are all within the location. My area here in the green, it's underlain by the lesser Himalayan rocks. This is known as the Kuncha Formation. It's Proterozoic phyllite metasandstone schist. And fieldwork last year, I wasn't able to, because I have to fly across the world, I couldn't take many rock samples back, but I was able to do some sampling while I was in the field with Schmidt hammers, and you can see this phyllite, that really shiny kind of blue luster sericite mica. This is all within the location, the bedrock. Historical satellite imagery indicates that the slope was intermittently active in the past. You can see here in 2004. So just kind of look at the outline here. You can see 2004, there's some failures. We move forward. 2012, the larger kind of mass movement, also along the toe here. You can see the meandering Suncoast kind of cutting the toe. And the major 2014 event. What I noticed before I was coming last year in the imagery was, you can see on the top here, this new freshly kind of exposed area. So if we zoom in on this location, the star is where I'll be taking the photographs. So I'm standing right here. This is, again, the photograph. I'll go in more detail with that. Zoom into this location where you see that movement. Again, we'll zoom in again here. You can see the seepage is discontinuity set here, and I was standing right here, and you can see this layer, this abrupt kind of contact here of this layer of residual, highly weathered soil. The orangish red color, I believe, is from the oxidization of iron-bearing minerals, so pyrite, fluorite, biotite in the Proterozoic, the phyllite. And I just estimated by the volume. Again, I apologize for everyone who, this might be a review, but it's just, you find an outcrop, a big area, and you place a tape measure across it, and you're able to get every discontinuity set information. You're able to get the aperture, the spreading of it, the roughness, persistence, is there water. This is all important for numerical modeling, because remote sensing, you're doing a lot of guessing. Doug mentioned the geological strength index. This is another input for numerical modeling. And uniaxial pressure strength, so I'm not able to do testing on the rocks for the strength, the cohesion, friction. But in the field, you can use Schmidt hammers, geological hammers. You're able to get estimates of the strength. So you can see here I was getting around 80 megapascals, and this goes around the R4 region, which correlates to the phyllite. So the methods, so characterization of large landslides such as Jure, remote sensing starting to be really popular. So what I used here, I'll go over everything I've used. So you can see here is the terrestrial laser scanner. You're able to get sub-centimeter 3D point cloud accuracy from about 4 kilometers away. It's important to note that you have scale bias and orientation. Scale bias means if you don't actually get the right resolution, you're going to get point clouds that are spaced around 1 or say 30 centimeters. You can't measure fractures that are that much smaller because you can't see them. And orientation biases, so I did a lot of scanning at the toe, but you can't see on top of these steps, so the scanner actually, there's occlusions in your point clouds. So that's why I was able to I found a few areas across, and it was about 180 meters higher that reduced the occlusions. And as Doug mentioned, we used Durham University's Regal VZ4000. And the photogrammetry, I used the terrestrial digital photogram. You get 2D high-res images, and this creates detailed 3-dimensional models. So the equipment I use is, you can see it here, is a 50 megapixel Canon EOS 5D. I use focal lengths up to 400 millimeters. I use the gigapound robotic head, so the automated capturing technique, and I also use a GPS receiver, so your models are really geo-referenced, everything's accurate. As Doug mentioned, again, the UAV is a low-cost technique. It's successive automatic matching of overlapping photographs, and you're able to use free software such as AgiSoft PhotoScan, where you bring all these photos in and you get detailed high-res models. So it's a safe, rapid, on-site assessment in areas that you'd never be able to get to. So as I mentioned, in the scanner you get those occlusions. You're able to fly it up to the area, get really accurate DEM, start doing your mapping, joint set recognition, and then all this really leads into the monitoring and slope stability assessment. So I used Durham University's multi-rotor DJI Mavic Pro, 12 megapixel HD 4K camera. So the monitoring that I mentioned, I'll have 4 years of remote sensing 3D point cloud data. You can see here from 2016 and 2018. So this helps you with the evolution of slope stability. I used another open source software, so anyone can download this. It's called Cloud Compare. A plugin that's available within it is called Multi-Scale Model Cloud Comparison. Basically, you bring in different years of point clouds, and it overlaps the images. So from this example here is 2016, and I'm layering the 2018 above it, and I want to see, it'll tell you how much has changed, what direction, by color coding it. So you can see from 2016 to 2018, red and green represent erosion, yellow and blue represent deposition. So if you look at these areas, the top here is that 2,000 cubic meter mass movement that I showed you prior. This is actually the UAV model. You can see these locations here. So if we zoom in on the top left, where we see this kind of erosion, it's with this seepage here, the deposition in the blue. Zoom in to the second location. Again, here you can see the erosion, and the third location. So you can see this location here. You're able to start doing the point cloud measuring, getting discontinuities, bringing this in, and this gives you the potential failure mechanisms, your diffraction sets, and information. You then move over to linear equilibrium. So this is different software such as Slide and the 3-dimensional Slide 3D. It requires minimum input parameters. So you just need a representative slope geometry I got from the point cloud. You're able to do sensitivity analysis for areas you don't know. I didn't have data on cohesion or friction. So you bring this 2D model, and now the latest software we were able to have is now 3-dimensional models. So you're able to get this, actually you can see columns of the shear stress, how deep it's going, and just another way you can bring this into further modeling in a 3D problem. Moving over to more complex is the Continuum. As Doug mentioned, it's for homogeneous or highly fractured rock mass. So this is where stability is governed by the rock mass strength. I used implicit finite element methods, this is FEM, RS2 and RS3. And the other one is called explicit. Basically, implicit, you start the program and then you see the end result. Explicit, you're able to see how it was changing throughout the landslide as it was modeling. So the explicit, I use FLAC and FLAC 3D. And the discontinuum, so these are for structurally controlled, where you have joint sets that are controlling the strength of the rock, the stability. So it's represented by assemblage of discrete blocks. So it's able to actually detach the model, and you see rotation and see the velocities. I use 2D UDEC and the 3-dimensional equivalent and 3DEC. So as I mentioned, I went last year for my field work, and I'll show you preliminary results I have. Starting off with damage and hazard mapping, I went around just to make risk areas and kind of get all the data as I potentially can. So finding different areas and locations. This is along the landslide down there. Finding areas of pooling water, different locations. So finding where there's trees, where there's creeks. These are all incorporated into a map at the end that you can see everything along the location. Finding the creeks, tension cracks, mapping the depositional zone, moving over to the compressive strength. So this is actually within the headscarp. So that location I showed you zeroing, I actually was able to get into it, do some bedrock, some strength testing, which actually really helped. I was not just taking depositional rocks that you didn't really know where it came from. You can see here I was getting bedrock samples, and then the GSI, as Doug mentioned, you're able to see the structures and the surface quality. And then structural mapping, I ended up for 5 days, I have a GIS map of location. I hiked the entire location everywhere I could. I only found one area that was a good outcrop that I could do measurements on. So this is located, so the last where I showed I was doing rock samples right there. I hiked up to here and you can see this location. So I'm able to see this rock outcrop here. And I was able to get onto here, but this is where I started doing the virtual mapping, because this area was super dangerous. You can see the rocks that were everywhere. And actually when I was in the field, the rocks were actually falling there. So I wanted to find a way out to do the mapping. So you can see I'm getting mapping every single discontinuity that's going through, getting information about dip directions. And then I decided to leave that location after the rock fall occurred and getting a 3D model. So this is in a computer model I made of the photogrammetry. If we zoom into this location, I would never be able to see this step path geometry. Wouldn't be able to actually map it in the field because it's just impossible to get 40 meters high. So you can see here I did over 180 structural measurements in the entire location. One of just like, I don't want to show all of them, but I'll just kind of focus on here. You know the step path geometry of Jure? This location here, it's dipping down slope. This major kind of fault system here, this is actually on the north side. So if you look on the south side now, you can see it's about 60 meters high. This is cutting through, and it's on the same kind of orientation as that step geometry. And about in Berbice, when I'm driving for my field work, this very similar structure is coming at Berbice. You can see it around the corner. If I click it, there we go. Standing here in the field, you can take a strip here and start manually mapping this by fitting discontinuities or planar. And then you can, this is the 3D model, and you can start finding your discontinuity sets based on all your mapping. You can compare field mapping with high-res, the computer mapping. You can get your lateral releases, you can find the back scarps, and potentially where the water is draining through. And then another step is called window mapping. So you pick a selection, it's usually 10 meters square there. You can see my scan line here. So let's zoom in on number 1 here, where I'd never be able to get under this overhanging block. You can see the model is really highly detailed. I'm able to start manually fitting planes on here and exporting it to understand the discontinuity sets. And now there's also, this is all within Cloud Compare, as mentioned, free software. That one is using a compass, so it's manually, you can fit everything. And there's also an automatic method where it finds all the orientations and it automatically groups it all for you. So then you can start breaking this up into the discontinuity set. So for example, the set 1 here, you can see that. Set 2, the back, high angled, and the low. Set 3. The TLS and TDP stations, these are all the GPS locations. So initially I started along the toe, but you can see how I'd be getting a lot of occlusions in these locations. So for example here, 4 stations along the Arnaco Highway. This is around 830 meters above sea level. If we take places here, this is how my view that I can see, not able to get there. So that's made me wonder, can I make it over here? And there's actually a truck little trail that you can get to at Barabisa. You just got to cut across, and I was able to get on to the other side and get these locations. So if we zoom into these, you can see me standing, except this is about 130 meters higher up. But the problem is now you're 1.5 kilometers away, so your scan times are, instead of 30 minutes, they're 2.5, 3 hours long. But if you do it, if you take the time to do it, you're able to get, this is my scan. This is from 1.5 kilometers away. I have this model now. I can start seeing the seepage, the deposition. I can start, this is one center point spacing. You can see this on top here, the recent failure that I was mentioning. It's super effective for mapping. And this is that was the model I used for the change detection on top of the other one. So remote sensing, the UAV. So here it is taking off, and the next photo is going to be the 3D model. That's the model. And you don't have to just use only the scanning or the photogrammetry. You can start combining different remote sensing. So this is UAV, but I can't really see too good there, not the best resolution. If we take this from 1.5 kilometers away, the photogrammetry, I can start zooming into locations, getting more information on structures, seepage, contacts. I use a lot of GIS to manage, visualize all my data, regional, and using different types of maps, as Doug mentioned, hill shades, slope aspect, really helpful for mapping the area. But you can also bring this into the 3rd dimension, also very helpful when you're bringing it into the Hololens, everything needs to be 3D. And here's an example of the 3D model that I used for numerical modeling. So I took a cross-section actually through this and estimated the pre-failure surface, so I wanted to see what would potentially cause it. So you can see in the red here is the pre-failure I estimated, blue is the present day. I won't go into detail about any of the numerical modeling results. I want to really touch on the GeoViz aspect. But you can see the continuum here. I started off really simple, didn't have any joints. You can see here's the deformed mesh. This is showing how it's moving. You add in joint sets. You can see the SRF. Below 1 means it's potential failure. Above 1 means it's stable. And adding in more. So that high kind of fault, I wanted to include those. And you can see the movement in the deformed mesh. And then again, bringing this in RS3 so you can now start putting these into the Hololens. Elevation models. This is a regional DM I made through actually Google Earth. Now terrain, so this is about 2 kilometers in each direction. You can see Jure located here. Some interesting locations in the back. You can see this. This helps me a lot with start doing hazard mapping, adding in polygons, communicating with Doug and if we're in the office. The change detection again, so now you can have the scale here again, red, green, erosion, yellow, blue. Now start showing this instead of just bringing everyone to a computer to see or printing out results, I can have everyone interacting, I can pass people the results. So this is how I made a menu, so within Unity. And for example, you can click anything on here, and it's just like on your computer, you click start, and okay, I want to see my structural measurements. Shows you everywhere you were. Again, click here, I want to see where I was in the field. You can click this. It shows you the model I used, and it probably looks pretty small, but you can see each like GIS location. Click these, it shows you what you did that location, what was the resolution. Let's see the scan. Slope stability, now you can start showing these numerical models as 2D images, 3D. I could put it on the wall here and start drawing beside it, comparing it. So discontinuity mapping, again, that's scanline outcrop I was describing. I click scanline outcrop, and you can see that red is where I was in the field. This is me wearing it, interacting with it, the UAV. You can see this is a field mapping and the computer mapping, so you can start comparing results while you're in the virtual realm. Example here, I'll show you a video I made for the presentation. So you can see, click it, you can see these the laser scanner. I created these in a software called Blender where you just create them by cylinder. See the GPS field locations. You can interact with the model, move it around where you want. And the holographic remote sensing, so the camera, 400 mil I put on there. The UAV we're flying, you can actually start grabbing these, making them bigger, how you want to see it. If anyone wants to see what you use in the field. The Brunton compass, so you're able to use this to start mapping on the virtual outcrops. You can rotate, scale the holograms how big. I can make the Brunton compass bigger than the university, make it small as anything. You can see the rock samples I took in the field. I was able to bring them by making 3D models. Now I can click these. It shows me in the field where I got them, what the strengths were. Again, and now you can see this menu is always facing you. It's always billboard. So I'm clicking terrain now, our slope. So the accurate GIS, enhanced interpretation and communication. You can see your terrain map, the regional, if I want to start comparing this in the field, bring this over, interact with it. So the discontinuity mapping, again, you click discontinuity mapping, it showed me where I was in the field, above it, the head start, showed me what I used there. And then if we zoom in on the virtual outcrop, this is referencing where I was in the field, the scan line window, and now there's me standing there, and this is a georeference outcrop that I don't feel safe going back to anymore, but I can do it in the office safely, and everything is within plus or minus 1 degree. I did some analysis to compare it, because it's all georeferenced. You're able to do live footage, discontinuity sets, and now I'm going to show a video, but this will be what I'm seeing right now. So now you can see, this is in the hallway at the university. You know, in the field, as I mentioned, it's dangerous. It could be raining. Just areas that you're not able to get to in the field. This is, again, as I mentioned, about 60 meters high. I can look down to it. And now I want to start doing some orientation measurements. So I made this video just showing how you can pin the measurements, and it's doing live feed, putting the discontinuity orientation on the stereo net here. So you can see it's all right now in red. You can do about as many measurements as you want. So you're able to find the orientations, live feed, pinning it on there again. You can get to areas that you're never able to get to in the field. As you can see, I start using kind of my understanding of the location. I want to see this structure now. Start pinning it again. You can see it's live, getting the locations on here. But then furthermore, instead of just you have all these red dots, you don't know which one's which. So now you can actually save it, export it, but also you can start identifying discontinuity sets. So you can see green now. I said there's 2 here. Within the entire area, I'll start pinning the locations where you did them. And you can see red, all the same discontinuity sets. So again, mapping inaccessible areas, this outcrop here, how can I get to this location? Would it be nice that I could be standing under this massive block to start mapping this step path fracture? But now with how we have it all georeferenced in the mixed reality, we're able to start, for example, start mapping traces that are all oriented. You can see the faults, you could do polygons, outcrops. So for example, here I did a fracture. So you start pinning the locations you want, and other people could be wearing the headset also and comparing the results. are, if no one likes that area, you say, no, 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 I want this one here, and then it's just easy, move around, communicate it. Because if in Canada, not everyone can come with me to Nepal, so it's nice to bring it back and get other people's judgment. So just touching up on what I presented on, I showed you some of my master's research, showed you how I got all the data through field, terrain, and remote sensing, the processing analysis and preliminary results, just some of that historical satellite imagery prior, and also how I saw before. Showed you how I used some monitoring.
The 2015 earthquakes, trying to provide information to support the National Reconstruction Authority, particularly those communities that face landslide risk, and particularly landslide risk that's changing in the years since the earthquake occurred. So this is a piece of work that's funded by the UK government through the DFID, and it's very much a collaboration between Durham University, but also colleagues at NSET, several of whom are here in the audience today. So in fact, by far the majority of the work that I'll show you today has been conducted by Ram Damar, who are sat in the audience, so many thanks go to them. We're working at the moment as part of something called the Durable Solutions Consortium, and that's feeding information into those sites which are deemed at high risk of, due to earthquake-triggered landslides. Okay, so this is at a much bigger scale than the work that Doug and Jesse have talked about, but it still uses remote sensing, and it still uses a form of numerical modelling, which we present and analyse in a GIS-based format. Okay, so I don't need to tell you the significance of landsliding in Nepal, but I think the context here is important, and I'll reflect on this when I come to the results that we've generated. So a recent paper by someone we've already mentioned, Dave Petley, many of you will be familiar with his landslide blog, and he started Durham's work in Nepal on the Rural Access Programme around 20 years ago, and that's where our involvement in landsliding in Nepal started. So Dave has just published a paper with one of my former students, Mel Froud, looking at the global impact of landslides. And if you look at the statistics they generate, Nepal harbours a disproportionate level of impacts due to landsliding. So, for example, 10% of global fatal rainfall-triggered landslides occur within Nepal. If you compare that to the land area of Nepal, that's a very, very high rate of impacts. 93% of those fatality-induced landslides occur within the monsoon. That's an important thing I'm going to come back to shortly. Many of the landslides around the world are related to construction, so road construction, and 5% of all construction-related landsliding happens in Nepal. So poor geotechnical engineering standards, the proliferation of rural road construction has a big impact on these statistics. If you look at who is impacted by those landslides, it affects a particular part of society as well. So predominantly women, or women and children who are working on these sites. So it's a real problem in terms of trying to reduce these impacts. Okay, NSAT are pioneering in terms of earthquakes, and think about how that pans out in terms of landslide. The 2015, this is all to do with rainfall-triggered landsliding. The 2015 earthquake was incredibly significant. So if you compare the number of landslides that happened on the day of the earthquake, that's equivalent to around 200 years of normal landslide activity in Nepal, purely by landslide number. I'll show you some statistics there. And what I want to focus on today is how do those landslides that were triggered in the earthquake in 2015, what threat do they pose now, and how is that changing? So, if you need a diagram to convince people that landsliding is a problem for Nepal, this is Dave Petley's data set. So each of the black dots on this map shows the location of a landslide that killed at least one person. And so the combination of steep topography, intense monsoon rainfall, so the kind of geotechnical characteristics, but also a vulnerable, predominantly rural population generates this kind of situation. So for Nepal, I don't need to tell you this, it's a really big issue. I think this is a really nice demonstration, a really horrific demonstration of that problem. Okay. A key outcome of the work which Dave Catley has done is looking at the timing of when landslides occur during the year in Nepal relative to the monsoon. So this is a graph that shows basically time during the year. So we're starting in January here, going through to December on the right-hand side. And the data is binned into 5-day periods. And the frequency distribution here is the average number of fatal landslides that happen within each of those 5-day periods. And what we see is that on the onset of the monsoon, so kind of end of June towards July, you get a very rapid increase in the number of fatality-inducing landslides. And that peaks in August, but it then tails off over a much longer period as the monsoon recedes. So this pattern happens every year, and so to some extent that's predictable. So we know when fatal rainfall-induced landsliding is due to occur. The big problem with the 2015 earthquake was this happened approximately 60 days before the onset of average annual fatality-inducing landslides. So we had a period of about 2 months before we knew that the landscape that was damaged in the shaking could then collapse when the intense rainfall occurred. Okay, so this is a photograph from the Upper Botacosi. So the China border is just to the left here, and the Arnica Highway is down in the bottom of the valley. This is an area that I'll refer to quite frequently as I talk. If you look at similar earthquakes to the Gorkha earthquake, so Wenchuan, the Kashmir earthquake, on average, around 25 to 35% of fatalities are in some way related to landsliding. And that's either due to houses being washed away, building collapse due to subsidence of the buildings, rock falls, boulders, debris flows. What I want to argue here is that these landslides that occurred on the day of the earthquake, they're not just a problem on that day, but they're a problem both for the reconstruction and also in terms of preparing for the next earthquake. So this is an issue that goes on for maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe longer. And that's what I'm going to try and explain to you from the data that we've collected. Okay, so the aims and objectives of what we've done, we're trying to monitor how the landslides that were triggered in the earthquake are evolving pre and post every monsoon since. So how are the landslides themselves changing? And then how is the hazard that they present change? And how is the risk that that poses to individual households evolving as well? So we're trying to do a risk assessment for individual household locations in this. So it's quite a high resolution assessment. And trying to then use this to relate it to what people on the ground understand about the risks that they face. We're feeding this into the National Reconstruction Authority and also into local government, so the local palakas, who have responsibility for managing the risks that the communities face. And longer term, this maps onto efforts in disaster risk reduction. Okay, so some important things about what I'm going to show you. This isn't a conventional landslide susceptibility assessment. What we're doing here is providing a rolling assessment of the landslides that are in the earthquake as a result of in the landscape as a result of the earthquake. We're providing this over the 14 worst affected districts where most of the landslide impacts were concentrated, and this is at an individual household level. We're only assessing the landslides which were triggered in the earthquake and are existing today in the landscape, so we're considering how they might evolve going forwards. And so geology here is a kind of implicit consideration, because those landslides only occur in locations where the geological conditions permit. We're only assessing landslides which we can see in satellite images. We're trying to do a big scale assessment here, so there will always be locations where the landslides are too small or they don't have a visible footprint in the satellite image. We're providing a risk score. It's not an absolute risk score, so it's not a probability of this will happen, but it's a relative score to allow people to prioritise where the problems might be located. And fundamentally, what we're doing is reliant on having good quality data. And so the work that Ram and Damar have been doing is around creating very good quality landslide maps, but this is reliant then on having a good elevation data set from digital elevation models, and we're using medium resolution satellite imagery, and I can explain why we're doing that rather than the highest resolution imagery later on. Okay, so I want to provide you with a kind of conceptual model of why we're doing this. So if you think of this graph as time along the bottom axis, and each of these blue bars is a monsoon period. And this measure on the y-axis could be the number of landslides or the total risk posed by landslides. From Dave Petley's analysis, we saw that every year you get this shape of landslide occurrence, so fatal landslide occurrence or landslide risk. When the earthquake occurs, we expect this to increase, so the number of landslides to go up very rapidly. But what we're interested in is how do these thousands of landslides change in the following years? So this is 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and going forwards. And at what point does this risk level come back to pre-earthquake situation? So that might be at a broad scale. You can think of this as well as an individual landslide scale. So we know before the earthquake there were lots of landslides. The area we're looking at, that's about 5,000 landslides before the earthquake with no seismic shaking. We know that the earthquake will trigger more landslides, so we want to know, are these different? And then how do they change through time? And what does the risk that they pose, how does that change through time? Okay, so another simple conceptual model comes from our broad understanding of how earthquakes trigger landslides. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of topographic amplification. So if you look at a landscape that's just experienced an earthquake, many of the landslides are located high up on the ridge tops, high up in the mountains, because those areas experience the most violent shaking. So you end up trying to use freely available data. So this is all Sentinel data from the European Space Agency. It's captured every 7 days, and it's made freely available to anybody. We're then using free open source GIS software, so this is QGIS, and we've worked with NSET to develop a protocol for mapping the location of landslides. So these polygons, each of these represents the footprint of the landslide that's visible in the satellite imagery. And we've done that across the entire area of the 14 earthquake affected districts. We've done that 11 times. So 3 times before the earthquake to see the background condition, and then twice a year for every year since the earthquake. Okay, so this is our inventory. This is the landslide situation as of the day of the shaking in 2015. So every grey polygon on this area is the location and the shape and size of the landslide. And you've probably seen many papers that have done similar kinds of analysis. Some show 5,000 landslides, some show 20,000 landslides, and that difference is due to the resolution. So we've done this not just for this date, but for 11 different time periods. So what I want to focus on now is the current situation. So this is the map we created after the last monsoon. And if I flick back between these two, you will see it's not just the colour that's changing, but the location and the number of the landslides is shifting considerably. So if you look in the northern parts of Sindipalchuk, going into Roshua, you'll see some areas which have landslides now, which didn't have landslides before. So the change in the risk is quite considerable. Okay, to give you a more detailed example, I'm going to focus again on the Upper Botakosi. So here we're just between the village of Chaku and up towards Gadari at the border. The border's the purple line in the top right. The situation before the earthquake, there were landslides commonly associated with the road, the rural road construction. They tended to be small, and they tended to happen in the same kind of locations each year on year. So people are quite familiar with the risk that this posed. We then look at the impact of the earthquake. They're the landslides that were triggered on the day of the earthquake. And so now what we're interested in is how is this changing since? So if we go to after the monsoon in 2015, you'll see that the shape of the landslides has changed quite considerably. So many now extend much closer to the valley bottom. They're much more mobile because they turn into debris flows. We've also got a lot of new landslides that weren't there after the earthquake. The ground was damaged and then they've been remobilised. Okay, if we now flick through our inventory through 16, 17, then 18, so that's the current situation. You can see the orange landslides are very, very different to the situation that we had immediately after the earthquake. Okay. So what we're interested in is thinking about what effect does this have on the exposed population, the people who live in these areas. So we have a data set that includes the location, the GPS position of every household in the 14 earthquake affected districts. So we've accessed that through the National Reconstruction Authority, and it contains just over 1 million buildings. We have at the moment around 18,000 landslides as of the situation after the last monsoon. And so what we're interested in doing is taking the landslides, so this red polygon, and thinking about what risk does it pose to individual buildings. And so we've taken the slide situation, and we're considering what's the worst possible thing that could happen if there was a very, very bad monsoon season. And our idea is that each of these landslides could turn into a debris flow, and it could flow down slope as long as possible. Okay, so we use a numerical model. It's a flow model with a flow routing and a stopping algorithm based on the rheology of the debris flows. So we use each of these red polygons as the source, and then we run those out across the landscape. And so the colours on this map is the probability of that location being hit by a landslide from somewhere above. Okay, so what we then do is overlay the house data. So each individual building is a dot on this map, and then we extract the probability of that house being hit by the landslide from above. We've done this here for 2015, so the hot colours, where you have oranges and reds, so there's a couple of reds on here, they're relatively high risk, and the lighter white colours are relatively low risk or no risk at all. So this is 2015. If I go to the next slide, this is now the difference between 2015 and 2018. So blue areas, the risk is reducing, red areas, the risk is increasing. So we can identify villages or settlements where the problem is improving or the problem is actually getting worse. And so this is up to date, whereas the NRA assessment was field-based, and so it's very difficult to keep that up to date. Okay, so if we go back to our conceptual model, we can replot this graph but with some real data. And one of the interesting things we find is that before the earthquake we had around 5,000 landslides. That increased to around 13,000 on the day of the earthquake, and it went up, as we would expect, after the first monsoon, through to 2016. And then from 2016 onwards, the numbers started to come down back towards base level, but we're still a long way away from the pre-earthquake condition. There's a really interesting thing that's happened in 2018. And after talking to, looking at the maps, looking at the data that Rand Damar have produced, talking to people who have been working on this issue, I think I'm right in saying this was the time of the local elections, and there was a big push for rural road construction. And if you look at the satellite images, many of the new landslides which are appearing here are associated with building roads in areas which were within the 14 earthquake affected districts. And so it seems that the damage from the earthquake makes areas which were previously safe now very vulnerable if you start building roads through. Okay, so this is the NRA geohazards assessment. Many of you are perhaps familiar with this, with the category 3, 2 and 1, where category 3 is a suggested relocation. Our data looks more like this, so there's obviously a higher number because this is building by building. And the hot colours on here are potentially sites where we have concerns about the current situation, not the situation in 2015, but the situation now. Okay, so in terms of the outputs that we generated, we have an individual house level risk history from the landslides. We've tied this to the NRA assessment, and we've mapped this now into map sheets for the 135 palicas which are in the 14 affected districts. And so I think this is potentially, we're hoping this is a useful resource for local government to actually help identify areas which they need to be providing support to. We have an online GIS, which I can show you in a minute. This just gives you a feel for what we're dealing with. So in 2015, there's around 2.4% of buildings, so around 26,000 that were at risk from landslides. That's gone up now to more like 3%. So it's not a problem that's going away quickly. These are our map sheets. It's taken us a long time to learn how to use ArcMap in Nepali, but we think we've just about got that. But if you spot any spelling mistakes, please tell us. We've produced these through talking with the Gampalika officials of what would be the most useful format for these maps. At the moment, we're going through a process of getting the approval of the NRA for these to be distributed. To zoom in, this is the kind of information that we've got. So again, the upper boat's cosy. The NRA sites are the triangles, our sites are the circles, and there seems to be quite a good tie together of different locations. But here we're giving information on a house-by-house level. That's our GIS. We have it in a 3D online version of ArcMap. It's accessible if you have a web browser. So the intention is this would go to the Gampalika level kind of computer access point for local people to be able to access the information. Okay, so some ideas about how this could be used. It's kind of up to date. I won't spend much time going through that. I guess the key thing is this is not a replacement for going to the field, assessing the geological conditions, doing the kinds of work that Jesse's been doing, the local stability assessments. That's what the decision should be made upon. This is a way of identifying which locations to visit, I think. Okay, so some key points. 2015 was very significant in terms of increasing landslide activity in this area, and our data implies that this is going to stay at very exaggerated levels for several years to come. The household level data, we're using this to try and assess, to make it comprehensive, to make sure that no location has been missed in the assessment to date. But what we're doing is very fundamentally reliant on DEM quality. So having an improved DEM will improve our flow routing algorithms, and that will improve the distinction between areas of risk and areas not of risk. There's likely to be an impact on everyday livelihoods and the recovery process, and thinking about ways of supporting people to live safely alongside these landslides. Many of these landslides you can't stop them. So much of the work that we've been doing is around communicating kind of low-tech monitoring to communities and how they may actually understand the risks they face rather than necessarily trying to stop them. Okay, and I will leave that there.
Extremely difficult to calculate because I remember that in somewhere like Hong Kong, they look at hundreds of landslides just to get the parameter for a very small region for a natural landslide. So how does your online system deal with that, and how the resolution of your DEM, because the channel is also extremely important, as I guess. How accurately does it really show?
So we use a flow model that has a routing algorithm, so it decides which direction downslope will the debris flow go. And that's where the DEM resolution is important, because as you said, the channel may be 10 metres wide, so if your DEM is bigger than 10 metres, you will miss the channel. The DEM that we're using in this is ALOS, so it's a 20-metre DEM. We're trying to access a 5-metre DEM at the moment to be able to do this more distinctly. We've done an analysis that suggests that if you improve the resolution, the numbers won't change, but the distinction between high risk and low risk will become more clear. In terms of the basal rheology, the approach that we're taking here is, because we can't simulate accurately every debris flow, we take a worst case scenario. So our analysis is based on what's the worst possible run out. So we have a very, very fast velocity, and it's based on the Fabrician angle as well. So the Fabrician angle is very shallow, so it will travel a long distance.
Thank you. Thank you very much.